The highway stretched ahead, a black ribbon unwinding under a sliver of a moon. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold against her skin. Mile after mile passed, the scenery unchanging. Dark trees, empty fields, the occasional abandoned gas station. She glanced at the fuel gauge, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. It was getting low. The engine hummed, a steady drone against the silence of the night. The air inside the car was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something else, something indefinable, almost metallic. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The road seemed to go on forever, leading her deeper into the heart of nowhere. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that danced at the edge of her vision. Every tree seemed to take on a sinister shape. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered threat. Sarah tried to focus on the road, on the white lines blurring past. But her eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of life. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh of the wind. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, making you hyper-aware of every small sound, every fleeting thought. Sarah turned up the radio, hoping to break the silence, but all she got was static. A wave of unease washed over her. She was alone, truly alone on this desolate stretch of highway. The static crackled and hissed, filling the car with an unsettling white noise. Sarah fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear station, but it was no use. The static persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to press against her eardrums, a physical force. She felt a growing sense of unease. Then a voice. Faint at first, barely audible above the static, but definitely there. A woman's voice, high and thin, almost a whisper. It spoke in a language Sarah couldn't understand, a series of guttural sounds that sent a chill down her spine. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. The voice grew louder, closer, weaving in and out of the static. It seemed to be calling out, pleading for something. Help! Mercy. Sarah couldn't tell. The words were unintelligible, yet the tone was unmistakable. It was a cry of despair, a sound that resonated deep within her soul. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The voice, the static, the oppressive silence of the night, it was all too much. She slammed her hand down on the radio, cutting off the sound abruptly. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the voice itself. She felt as though she were being watched, as though unseen eyes were boring into her back. The sudden appearance of headlights in her rearview mirror made her jump. A car had materialized out of the darkness, its lights flickering erratically. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and now this, a phantom car appearing out of nowhere. Relief warred with apprehension. The car behind her was old, its paint faded and peeling. It seemed to be moving slowly, almost hesitantly, as if it was stalking her. The flickering headlights cast strange, dancing shadows on the road ahead. Sarah pressed down on the accelerator, trying to put some distance between herself and the unsettling vehicle, but the car stayed with her, its presence a constant, menacing shadow in her rearview mirror. It seemed to be toying with her, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down, always maintaining a steady distance. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Fear began to creep into her heart, a cold, insidious feeling that spread through her veins. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. The flickering taillights of the car behind her were like malevolent eyes, watching her every move. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that she was being drawn into something dark and dangerous. She was alone, trapped on this desolate highway with an unknown entity. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by her headlights. A woman, her face pale and distraught, stood next to a rusted, broken-down car. She waved frantically, her cries for help barely audible over the wind and the hum of Sarah's engine. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her car skidding slightly on the asphalt. The woman stumbled towards her, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair matted and disheveled. She reached out a hand, her fingers grasping at the air. "Help me!" she pleaded, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Please, help me!" Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. Should she help? It could be a trap. The desolate highway, the flickering car behind her, the woman's frantic pleas. It all felt wrong, like a scene from a nightmare. Fear warred with compassion, but the woman's desperate cries tugged at her heartstrings. But the image of the flickering car behind her flashed in her mind. The unease returned, stronger than ever. A primal instinct took over. Sarah slammed her foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward. She couldn't stay. She didn't know what dangers lurked in the shadows, but she knew she had to get away. She sped off, leaving the woman behind, her cries for help fading in the distance. Section 5. The Endless Loop. Sarah drove on, her heart pounding in her chest. The image of the woman's desperate face burned into her memory. She pushed the accelerator harder, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the highway. The road seemed to stretch on forever. The same dark trees, the same empty fields, blurring past her window. She glanced at the road signs, trying to orient herself, but the names were unfamiliar. She had never been on this road before. It was as if she had entered a different dimension, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. A growing sense of disorientation washed over her. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of darkness. Then she saw it again, the rusted, broken-down car on the side of the road. And there, standing beside it, was the woman, her pale face illuminated by the headlights. She waved frantically, her cries for help echoing in the stillness of the night. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her mind reeling. How was this possible? She had driven miles, yet she was back where she started. The road seemed to be looping, bringing her back to the same spot, the same terrifying scene. A wave of panic washed over her. She was trapped, caught in an endless cycle of fear and despair. She slammed her foot on the accelerator again, the car roaring to life, desperate to break free from the loop. But the road seemed to twist and turn, always leading her back to the woman and her broken-down car. It was a nightmare, a terrifying, inescapable nightmare. Section 6. Shadows closing in. The shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in on her from all sides. The trees lining the highway transformed into menacing figures, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The sliver of moon disappeared behind a thick bank of clouds, plunging the world into near total darkness. Sarah's headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating only a small circle of the road ahead. The car behind her was still there, its flickering headlights casting eerie, distorted shadows that danced on the trees and the road. It seemed to be closing in on her, its presence a constant, suffocating weight on her chest. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes darting nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. The air inside the car grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The metallic smell she had noticed earlier intensified, now mingled with the scent of decay, of something rotting. Sarah gagged, her stomach churning. The atmosphere was oppressive, suffocating, as if the very air itself was trying to crush her. Fear clawed at her throat, threatening to overwhelm her. She felt as though she was being watched, as though unseen eyes were boring into her, drinking in her terror. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, taking on grotesque shapes that danced at the edge of her vision. She was losing control, losing her grip on reality. The highway was no longer just a road, it was a gateway to something dark and terrifying. Section 7. Voices in the Night. The static on the radio returned, louder and more insistent than before, but this time it wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus of voices, whispering, murmuring, chanting in a language she couldn't understand. The sounds swirled around her, filling the car, invading her mind. She tried to turn off the radio, but her hand wouldn't obey. The voices grew louder, closer, pressing against her eardrums, seeping into her consciousness. They seemed to be calling out her name, beckoning her, luring her deeper into the darkness. Sarah covered her ears, trying to block out the sounds, but they penetrated her defenses, echoing inside her skull. The voices were everywhere, inside the car, outside the car, all around her. They whispered secrets, told stories of pain and despair, of loss and regret. They spoke of things she couldn't comprehend, of horrors that lay just beyond the veil of reality. Sarah felt her sanity slipping away, her grip on the world loosening. The whispers turned into screams, into wails of anguish and despair. The car filled with a cacophony of sound, a symphony of suffering that threatened to shatter her mind. Sarah screamed, a primal cry of terror that was swallowed by the voices. She was drowning in a sea of sound, lost in a vortex of horror. The world was spinning, the road was blurring, the shadows were closing in. Section 8. Lost Souls. Through the swirling chaos of voices and shadows, Sarah glimpsed faces in the darkness. Pale, gaunt faces with hollow eyes that stared at her with an unnerving intensity. They seemed to be floating in the air, drifting through the trees, their forms shimmering and indistinct. They were the lost souls, the inhabitants of this nightmare highway. The faces multiplied, crowding around the car, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. They reached out to her with skeletal hands, their fingers brushing against the windows, leaving trails of cold, viscous slime. Sarah recoiled in horror, her body trembling uncontrollably. The lost souls pressed closer, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and anger. They seemed to be trying to pull her out of the car, to drag her down into the darkness with them. Sarah fought back, kicking and screaming, but her struggles were futile. They were too many, too strong. Their eyes burned into her, their voices echoed in her mind, their touch sent shivers of pure terror down her spine. They were the embodiment of her worst nightmares, the personification of all her fears and anxieties. They were the lost souls, and they wanted her to join them. Section 9. The fog. A thick white fog rolled in, engulfing the highway in a swirling mist. Visibility dropped to near zero. Sarah could barely see the road ahead, the trees, the shadows. The world was reduced to a swirling white void. The fog was cold and damp, clinging to her skin like a shroud. The voices grew louder, closer, their whispers now laced with a chilling laughter. The fog seemed to amplify the sounds, making them even more terrifying. The faces of the lost souls appeared and disappeared in the swirling mist, their eyes burning with an unholy light. They were all around her, closing in, their laughter echoing in her ears. Sarah swerved the car violently, trying to avoid the ghostly figures that darted in and out of the fog. The car skidded on the slick asphalt, the tires losing their grip. She slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car spun out of control, plunging off the road and into the swirling white abyss. The fog pressed in on her, suffocating her, filling her lungs with its icy breath. The laughter of the lost souls grew louder, closer, more menacing. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. She was lost, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Section 10. Trapped in the nightmare. The car came to a stop, the impact jarring her body. Sarah opened her eyes, expecting to see twisted metal and shattered glass, but instead she saw nothing but the swirling white fog. She was still in the car, but the car was no longer on the road. It was suspended in a void, surrounded by an endless expanse of white. The voices were still there, whispering, laughing, mocking her. The faces of the lost souls appeared and disappeared in the fog, their eyes burning with a malevolent glee. Sarah realized then, with a chilling certainty, that she wasn't on a highway anymore. She wasn't even in the real world. She was trapped in a nightmare, a realm of shadows and whispers, of lost souls and endless terror. The highway, the car, the woman, the flickering lights, it was all a construct of her own mind, a manifestation of her deepest fears. She had driven into the heart of her own personal hell, and there was no escape. The nightmare would continue, looping and repeating, tormenting her for eternity. She was trapped, a prisoner of her own mind, lost in the endless labyrinth of her worst fears. The laughter of the lost souls echoed around her, a chilling reminder of her fate. She was one of them now, a lost soul trapped in the nightmare highway.